CEO of the Greater Wausau Chamber of Commerce. This event is part of our Business Week programming. Several events this week. Wednesday, we'll have Small Business of the Year awards. Thursday will be the Small Business of the Year recognition ceremony. And Friday, Name That Jingle virtual game show, a little bit of fun for our community. Before we get rolling, I want to thank Small Business Week sponsors. Presenting sponsor, Marshfield Clinic Health System. And we would like to pause and show a short video for you.
Your health is important. Marshfield Clinic Health System is committed to helping keep you and your family healthy and safe. We have options from home. See your current provider by phone or video, or a nurse practitioner through the Care My Way app. If you visit in person, count on us taking precautions to keep you safe by screening visitors, wearing masks, cleaning, and arranging waiting areas for social distance. We're here for you. Please visit marshfieldclinic.org for details.
I'd like to continue to thank our further sponsors, the Platinum sponsors, Sam's Club, Gold sponsors, Aspirus and Aspirus Arise, Silver sponsors, Clifton Larson Allen, CLA, Rooterware, LLC, LLSC, Wifley, LLP, Bronze sponsors, the Dirks Group, Fully Promoted, Ho Chunk Gaming Wittenberg, Wisconsin Public Service Corporation, Yachts Body and Custom Inc. And our media sponsors, Print, The Business News, Radio, Midwest Communications, Television, News 9, WAOW, Live Production, Gem Productions. Before we get rolling, I'd like to set a little bit of context for our program this morning. As we entered 2020, the economy was moving ahead with near record-setting stock market performance and record low unemployment. Our regional businesses were reporting strong business activity and expressed optimism for the future. The month of March brought an entire new set of economic circumstances with COVID-19 pandemic taking hold. The world as we knew it was being reshaped as countries across the world began to respond to controlling and slowing the spread of the virus. The global economy began and continues to transform. While business organizations in north central Wisconsin continue to learn and adapt in the current environment, our efforts to build a stronger economy through execution of the Greater Wausau Economic Development Plan continue. While the pandemic may have slowed our execution of the plan, we are moving forward in a rapidly changing global landscape. Questions we should be thinking about as a community. One, are we positioned to attract, retain, and develop the talent and workforce necessary for our community and businesses to thrive? Two, are we building a community that will be able to compete with other like-sized communities that people may be looking to as they seek smaller, safer, more affordable living opportunities? To help us understand these topics this morning, we are joined by DWD, Department of Workforce Development Secretary Caleb Frostman. Secretary Frostman will provide important information to aid businesses of all sizes as they continue to make workforce decisions. Following Secretary Frostman's comments on workforce development, our friends from TIP Strategies, John Roberts and John Karras, will provide information on how the pandemic is reshaping the economic development landscape and our community's opportunities to compete for talent, attraction, and business growth. So with that, Secretary Frostman, I'm just going to give a little bit more context before I turn it over to you. This morning, I got on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, and I went back to March of 2020. Unemployment in Marathon County, where Wausau is located, the county seat. March 2020, our unemployment was at 2.7%. April, that number jumped to 11.5%, and we know nationally and at state level that was much higher. And now in July, we're at 6.9%. So I just wanted to give those statistics a bit to the audience to show them where we're at today. But Mr. Secretary, I would welcome you and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here and always appreciate the opportunity to speak with Wisconsin business leaders around the state. And I appreciate the introduction and the segue, and I hope folks will be patient with me. This is my first time using this platform and also incorporating slides. We've been providing similar context on a statewide and a national basis around unemployment in this country. And the talking points are really compelling, but we thought visuals might even be more so for folks. I will work through these relatively quickly, but a couple of weeks ago, ABC News came out with a story talking about the unprecedented nature of the economic ramifications of COVID-19. And I think this first slide is really telling. The article talked a lot about the previous record in the U.S. for most initial unemployment claims in 1 week was about 695,000 people back in the '82 recession, and within 2 weeks of COVID, we had beaten that by tenfold. At 6.9 million people file in the end of March. So you can see the previous record against the Great Recession towards the bottom. And at the very far right is the onset of COVID-19 as far as new unemployment claims in the U.S. And that previous record of 695, we had 20 consecutive weeks over 1 million new claims in the U.S. That streak was broken, but then it went back above 1 million again last week. So that's a pretty striking visual as to what COVID-19 did and how fast it happened. And similar to Marathon County in Wisconsin, in March, we were at about that 3.3% unemployment rate, and 1 month later, we were at 13.3%. So really unprecedented rapidity and intensity as far as the onset of an economic downturn. And then these next few also just provide good visuals for what our state record previously looked like. So we don't have data going back to the '82 recession, but Wisconsin's previous record for initial claims was during the 2001 dot-com crash, and we more than doubled that in April. And again, showing where the Great Recession is in those levels. And then this is a quick visual against the '82 recession, Great Recession. And then this is more to put into context our claims in COVID-19 against the Great Recession. So this is the yellow line is the first 33 weeks of 2020, and the blue line is the first 33 weeks of the Great Recession. So pretty marked differences there between those. And then again, this is the weekly claims, so recurring claims that are required for payment, a very similar trend. And then just wanted to point out two last pieces of context. So in the first 5 months of COVID, we've had about 930,000 initial claims in Wisconsin, and that compares to about less than 290,000 in all of 2019. So a pretty massive increase in about half the time. And again, a very similar trend for those recurring weekly claims in the state of Wisconsin. So it's been obviously a pretty heavy lift for DWD. We've had to adjust on the fly. And one of the issues with unemployment insurance is that you are funded in large part based on formulas that look at economic indicators like the unemployment rate. And so when we started at COVID-19, we were funded at a rate commensurate with a 3.5% unemployment rate. And so to catch up with the staff necessary, of course, has taken some time. These next two slides, I'll go through pretty quickly as well, but they are a visual of where our claims volume has been as far as weekly claims. And I think this next picture is probably the most telling, but on the bottom are the weeks, the dates of where we were at. And there are different lines here. The big black one is just the overall weekly claims. The next one shows what's been paid. The red line is what's been denied. And then that yellow line is what is currently held in adjudication. So we are working in order of oldest claims first. So you can see a pretty strong trend toward the older claims being cleared, whereas the more recent ones are the ones that are likely flagged for issues in adjudication. But this next slide provides, I think, a good visual for comparison of what's been paid versus what's been denied and what's been held. So it's been, like I said, a pretty big lift for our team. We had to pretty rapidly hire a lot of folks. And so when you go from 3% unemployment to 13% the next week, we had to bring on, for the first time ever, vendors. So between hiring new people into DWD, reassigning some government employees, and bringing on vendors, we have nearly quadrupled our UI personnel from about 500 when we started COVID and I think we peaked just south of 2,000 in July. So we've had a serious on-ramp, and of course, bringing on that many people, vetting them, hiring them, training them has taken some time, but I think of great interest to a lot of folks. We've added a lot of adjudicators, about 400 new adjudicators into the system to help us clear through that caseload, and have also really expanded our phone capacity. We were at about 62 in March, and we are north of 500 today, which is a big jump. And so just wanted to create that context and let folks know what has been going on in UI. We continue to work from oldest claims first, and obviously have onboarded multiple federal programs, but we continue to work hard and make progress week over week on that caseload. And I think it's been I think somewhat refreshing. We're certainly not out of the woods yet as far as the volume of claims coming through, but one of the great success stories of the unemployment numbers that have come through has been the WorkShare program. And every time I get on a call with the chamber, I want to make sure that I evangelize how great WorkShare is. It's an opportunity for employers to reduce hours for their employees, and of course, then those employees get pro rata wages, but those employees stay attached to their benefits. They remain on the payroll, even partially, but then they're also eligible for partial unemployment insurance payments. So those folks are in a lot of cases almost made whole, but I think in a time like this, if we can avoid any full or permanent layoffs, employers are taking advantage of that. In March, prior to COVID, we had one employer with a WorkShare plan with about 20 employees. We peaked in July north of 650 plans with about 23,000 people participating on WorkShare. So if anyone on this call is an employer or works with employers through the chamber that are experiencing difficult times or might be experiencing that going forward, we would really encourage you to explore WorkShare. I can provide some of those opportunities to apply later in this presentation. It's very simple. We've got you do it via snail mail, via fax, or via email, but we have a dedicated staff working on WorkShare. And back in the spring, when the legislature, both state and federal, were passing laws to help aid recovery, some of those laws helped expand WorkShare eligibility. So where it was once the greater of 10% or 20 of your employees, you can now have as few as 2 employees in a WorkShare plan. And they also expanded, you can reduce up to 60% of the hours, whereas it was previously 50%. So a minimum of 10, now up to 60. So that's really, I think, helpful for a lot of employers. And then throughout the rest of the year, any WorkShare benefits will be paid through federal dollars, which is also attractive to Wisconsin employers. And so that's a good segue talking about the success of WorkShare into, again, as we ever so slightly, but I think with emphasis, pivot toward recovery and where our either existing programs can be helpful or where we are trying to innovate. For us, COVID-19 remains the first and foremost piece that has to be brought under control for economic recovery to occur. And so I would really encourage the folks in this call to look at Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation's guidelines. They've set forward some really good, in some cases, industry-specific guides for reopening and as far as safety for both customers and employees. And so for us, that first and foremost piece is containing COVID-19 through distancing, through hand washing, through mask wearing. And so that's a big piece of it for us, is getting that under control. And then, it was interesting before COVID, and obviously it's even more, pertinent this week, but there were pretty obvious fissures in our state and national economy as far as who was being left behind and some of the inequities in our economic system. And COVID has really highlighted those. And so we will continue to work really hard at DWD to make sure that our programs reach all Wisconsinites, and we will work really hard to help those that have been temporarily laid off, and those layoffs have become permanent here going forward. And so want to just make sure that the employers in this call are also aware of some of the resources we have available to them for free, one of which is jobcenterofwisconsin.com. That is our state's labor exchange for both employers and employees. It is free to post jobs and to post resumes, and that is meant to match those skills between the job seeker and what the employer is looking for. And we're hopeful that employers can easily find the candidates they're looking for via the skills they have by location, by military status, and unemployment insurance claimants are required to post their resume on jobcenterofwisconsin.com. And as of today, I think we were around 70,000 jobs on what we call JCW, and about 125,000 resumes. So a pretty robust job exchange. We would encourage folks to use that. We did peak in mid-June this summer with about 250,000 resumes on JCW. And so we're hopeful that folks will continue to use that exchange as it is free. And we are hopeful that we could marry some of those folks most interested in working along with those employers that are really in need of help. And I think the folks on this call are probably aware, but most job centers, the physical brick and mortar job centers throughout Wisconsin, are currently closed. We are doing a lot of work remotely. All services are being offered. And I think we've been pretty pleased with how well the virtual service delivery has gone. It has taught us a few lessons about the viability of virtual service delivery going forward. Also, some of the shortfalls of, not surprisingly perhaps, the broadband connectivity in parts of our state and/or computer access. So we've learned a lot of interesting things about computer access in the state and how we can deliver services virtually. But we are, I think, pleased with how that's going. We've had a couple of in-person, by appointment only services offered in Wisconsin Rapids, as well as in Milwaukee, and we're watching that very closely to see how that continues to play out and what could possibly be replicated around the state as far as a good return on investment. And we've got a really, really strong team, and I know the team in Wausau in particular is especially talented. Worked with them both on Verso as well as on the closing in Merrill earlier this year or late last year. But our rapid response teams, we hope to not use them any more than we have to, but they are extremely skilled at connecting recently dislocated workers with new work and employers to those job seekers. And so as they continue to be needed, we will certainly keep them at the ready to provide those services. And again, we're hoping not to have to use them any more than we have, but they certainly remain at the ready. And then I think I'll just wrap up with a couple of our flagship programs that we continue to lean into in this recovery, one of which is Wisconsin Fast Forward. We put forth awards for about $2.5 million worth of grants at the end of June. We are likely to put out another GPA for grants this fall. Maybe October is kind of what we're thinking at this point, but that's a pretty flexible workforce training program that's employer-led. So we're hoping to have those trainees get transferable, in-demand skills with recognized credentials, so those trained and paid-for skills can follow them, but also understand that employers might have unique needs. But we're hopeful that we're able to bring folks out of unemployment and also help those who are currently employed improve their position. And I think it's been important for Governor Evers and for DWD. Even before COVID, our focus was simultaneously on the quantity of jobs that we're able to fill, but also the quality of jobs that Wisconsinites are holding, and making sure that our workers in our state are able to not just cover their basic needs, but invest in themselves, invest in their health, invest in their future, and invest in their community. So when we talk about attraction of greater talent, we want to do all we can to make Wisconsin an attractive place for folks to come, find a job, start a business, and making sure that those jobs are the highest quality is a big piece of that. And segueing into that piece, I guess, is also our really strong, bullish stance on our apprenticeship programs. And I won't bore you with the history. Wisconsin happens to be the first state in the country to bring forth apprenticeship about 110 years ago. But we are really bullish on apprenticeship for a number of reasons, both youth apprenticeship, which I believe Wausau is a really successful user and coordinator of youth apprenticeship, but also on the registered side for adults. Again, that possibility of not just filling open positions. Obviously, it's very important and a top priority for us, but making sure that those employees can help stimulate the economy through their consumer spending and disposable income through a really high quality job. And apprenticeship provides that unique opportunity where you're learning an in-demand skill while on the job and getting paid a living wage. And so we're doing a lot to expand apprenticeship, both on the youth and registered side, into new industries. We're working hard to expand it into new geographies. And then we're also working really hard, again, kind of on that equity and inclusion lens, at least on the registered side, we've had a challenge having strong representation with women apprentices or apprentices of color, and so we're working really hard to make sure that we're able to be more inclusive on the apprenticeship side, kind of on all fronts, the industry side, the geography side, and who is utilizing the apprenticeship programs. And we were really pleased to receive a $9 million federal grant earlier this year to help us expand into new sectors, new occupations, and we continue to work to establish an incentive program for employers to further expand apprenticeship in our state. And we think that grant will also help us in that equity and inclusion piece. And just on the YA side, really quickly, we do expect another strong year this year. It's a slight dip from last year, and I think that's probably due to some of the challenges of instructing and working remotely in a post-COVID world. But we expect to have just under 6,000 youth apprentices this year. We put forward about $5 million grant for youth apprenticeship in this state to 37 consortia, which is just less than 400 school districts. And so we expect, our youth apprentice hosts, our youth apprentices are creative, and we're going to find a way to make this work going forward. And we're excited to see what YA brings in 2020 and 2021. And then the last piece I'll touch on is just we're excited in this new world where a lot of folks in Wisconsin are working virtually. We were able to introduce an e-workboard. So think of all the posters in the break room by the water cooler that explain labor laws for both employers and employees and what everyone's rights are. We were able to put all of those posters in an electronic location that are actually scannable by QR code, which is too advanced for me, but a lot of young folks are able to scan that in and access that information. And so that's at ewd.wisconsin.gov/eworkboard. But again, no matter whether it's pandemic or not, we want to make sure that we are supporting our workers' protection and making sure our employers are fully informed and that they're protected as well. So we're happy to bring that forward and are excited to deliver that for the workforce and for Wisconsin's businesses. So in a really fast 17 minutes, that's what we've been up to and kind of what we've been pivoting toward as far as recovery here in Wisconsin. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Renee Krings, Economic Development Specialist with the Greater Wausau Chamber of Commerce. Today, I will be moderating the Q&A segment for today's event. And with that, I would actually like to encourage our listeners at this time to submit questions for Secretary Frostman in the chat feature on the left side of your screen. Looks like we have some questions rolling in, but I do also have a quick question. Secretary, you mentioned how the WorkShare program may benefit businesses considering layoffs in their employees. Can you talk just a little bit more about the program and remind us where we might be able to learn more about the WorkShare program? Sure,
that's a great question. And so again, I've got a lot of links, which if folks have their pens handy, it's just dwd.wisconsin.gov/UI-tax/WorkShare. We are working on deploying a marketing slick for employers. We've got kind of an archaic version out there that was pre-COVID, and we're working on deploying that here in the next couple of days. And we are happy to send around to this chamber. I know the Green Bay Chamber asked for it, but the WorkShare program, like I said, is an opportunity for employers to keep their employees on the payroll for some portion of the week, allowing them to produce, and whether that's goods or services for the employer, they get pro rata wages based on the hours that they are working, and then they also get partial unemployment insurance based on their hours and wages earned. And then the biggest piece, like I said, perhaps is that they get to stay attached to their benefits, namely their health care, whereas under a layoff situation that might not be the case. And so it's really meant to be kind of a win-win for both the employer and the employee, and also for our state and our local communities, economies that rely on our families to buy groceries and buy dinners and consume goods and services in our local communities. And this is a way where folks are earning their keep with their employer, but they're also working reduced hours, and so that partial UI helps offset some of those reduced wages. And so it's really kind of a best case scenario for both employers to keep their employees engaged and updated on their skills and producing those goods and services, and also helps those families with that set of wages and the partial UI piece. And so it's really a strong solution. And for employers that are on the call and perhaps might be worried about their UI account being charged, like I said, through the end of the year, work-share benefits are going to be paid by the federal government. So that's another carrot for folks to consider this if they were already considering reduced hours or perhaps laying employees off.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question here from Christine, and she asks, has Wisconsin registered with FEMA for the $300 extra weekly benefits to help those unemployed?
So we are in the deep throes of analysis. I think we're coming to the end of that analysis in the next couple of days here, but we're always talking to our workforce association nationally and trying to dig in with DOL and FEMA. I think we've got a lot of our questions answered when that was first announced. There were far more questions than answers. I think there's a fair amount of clarity at this point, and we're hopeful to make a decision here next couple of days. We've got I think until September 10th to apply, and upon approval, states are allocated 3 weeks worth of benefits for that program. And so running the traps and making sure that we've got all our ducks in a row, I think we're in a place where we can hopefully have some finality and a decision on that in the next few days here.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question here from Benjamin, and he shares that he applied for the work share compensation in May and just got entered into the system here recently on August 10th. Can you share just some of the reasoning behind some of the delays, and also if an employer is part of the work share program, how timely can they expect to receive approval?
Sure, well, that's much longer, at least on the work share side, than what we've been hearing. So I'm not sure Benjamin's specific case. In some cases, perhaps if there are employees that have different employers and there were circumstances around a separation within the last 18 months, that could require adjudication or determining eligibility for that claimant for the partial UI. But generally speaking, we've had really quick turnarounds on work share. Obviously, on traditional UI for our normal claimants not in a work share program, it's been unfortunately longer. But we've not had much feedback on delays in work share, so I would certainly be interested in hearing more and try to find a way to solve that if it's a more widespread issue, and or help clarify for Benjamin's employer anything that needs to be done to get that cleared up sooner.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here from Carrie Ann. And she asks, can you speak to the changes proposed by the president regarding FPUC eligibility for work share participants?
Sure. So the new program that lost wages assistance, I think that's what she's referring to. It's the FPUC was the $600 a week that expired at the end of July. And this lost wages assistance put forward through FEMA is essentially meant to replace that program going back to the week of August 1st as far as unemployment is concerned. So work share employees that are on that program, it is our understanding at this point that if you are eligible for $100 at least in unemployment insurance, that you would be eligible for this lost wages assistance. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're receiving. If you're on a work share plan, that partial UI might be less than 100, but again, we continue to dig in and figure out all the nuances, but initial analysis would lead us to believe that if you are eligible for your maximum weekly rate, if that's more than 100, then you would be eligible for this lost wages assistance.
Thank you. Do you anticipate any additional state or federal workforce funds becoming available to help businesses?
So I definitely don't want to count any chickens before they hatch, but we have applied for a $15 million federal grant through the Economic Training Recovery Program through DOL. We're hopeful. We've got our fingers crossed. We think we put forth a pretty good grant proposal, and we're hopeful that we would see some of that funding to invest in workforce development across Wisconsin and across our industries here in our state. But we are kind of waiting with bated breath at this point to see if that comes our direction. But we're always on the lookout for grant opportunities, whether it's for apprenticeship, whether it's for COVID-19 relief. We are always looking for opportunities to take advantage of federal dollars to invest in Wisconsin.
Okay. Well, that's all I'm seeing. Are there any other questions before we move on to our next segment?
Renee, this is Dave. I'd like to just extend appreciation to the secretary for sharing his time today. I know you've, in your team in Madison, have just been overwhelmed. You talked about percentages, but you can carry those percentages into the hundreds of thousands of people that have been impacted by this. And so you continue to do good work. It's hard work at this point. Question for you. The DWD Work Board, I think that's a tremendous adaptation in this time. As a leader and having been in economic development before, there's always things when we hit a time of crisis like this, good things. What have you learned, Secretary, in terms of this is something that we have to keep doing, let alone having to work through the pandemic? But, what are some practices that you're learning from your team that we need to employ moving forward?
That's a really good, expansive question. I think it has been really challenging, and you do learn a lot about yourself and about your team and about the folks around you. And I think, making sure that we return, whatever that organization might be, but return to your core principles. What are your guiding principles that helped you draft your mission, your vision, and, in the midst of a crisis, not straying from those core principles. You can certainly adapt and develop new strategies, but how you treat people, how you expect to get the most out of your staff, that generally speaking hasn't changed. And we've tried to keep a big picture view on obviously driving the highest productivity possible out of our staff while appreciating the challenges that they are going through, the phone calls that they take and the vacations they've skipped and the long nights they've worked. And week over week, we want to continue to see really strong progress. And we believe going into this that the best way to get the highest productivity and the highest quality product out of our people is to make them feel supported and to make sure they know they're supported. And it's been a challenge with, obviously the not just the scrutiny, but just the challenges that Wisconsinites are facing, and they're very real, and the stories are heartbreaking. And it's been a challenge to keep focused on the important things we have to do on behalf of Wisconsin claimants. But I think returning to those guiding principles, even when, for me, it wouldn't be the case. When your hair's on fire, you just have to make sure that you're maintaining that level of consistency, and I guess for lack of a better word, in integrity, and that you're staying to those principles that brought you to this line of work in the first place. And I feel really fortunate that the people that work at DWD, and specifically in UI, work there not for the money, certainly not for the prestige, but because they care and want to help people. And of course, that has come in, very, very helpful as they've had to, grind through an extremely challenging 5 months and have an opportunity to help people every minute of every hour of every day. And so I'm grateful to, a team that really, really focuses on what they can do to, help their neighbor. And in this case, meaning our claimants here in the state.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate that. Renee.
All right. Thank you again, Secretary Frostman. Now we'll have an opportunity to hear from John Roberts and John Karras with TIP Strategies, the economic development firm that led the creation of the Greater Wausau Region Economic Development Strategic Plan. Today, Roberts and Karras will be revisiting the plan and will explore ways that our region can continue to achieve its goals in the face of economic uncertainty. Before we get started, I'd like to point out to the audience, feel free if you would like to expand the presentation view on your screen to full screen so that you can view the presentation a little better. All right, at this time, I'd like to welcome John Roberts and John Karras.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be with you again virtually. In fact, I was talking to John Karras before we began and how much we would miss the idea of being in Wausau physically and not just virtually. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to John and let him give you his sense of where our company has been, and also to highlight some of the major themes that we've been seeing around the country. I think we'll both be jumping in on that. And then give you a sense of where we see the successes and the opportunities coming out of the plan that was completed just about a year ago. So John, take it away.
Yes, thank you, John, and thanks, Renee, for the introduction. It's been about 2 years since we started working with Dave and Renee and the Chamber on putting together an economic development strategic plan for the greater Wausau region. And it was a little over a year ago that that plan was released and unveiled. So we really wanted to just give you, for some of you that were involved in that process, refresh you on who we are and what the plan included, but also take a look, as John mentioned, at what are the economic and workforce changes that have been happening in recent months, and what does it mean for your future in the Wausau region. So just as a quick reminder of TIP, our company, we are an economic development strategic planning firm, and the core mission that we have embraced over the last couple of decades is really looking at economic development holistically and working with cities and regions and states around the country to help them put together strategies that move their economies forward into the future. So we've been around since 1995, and we're actually headquartered in Austin, Texas. And we started off as primarily a Texas firm, but about 2 decades ago, John worked on a project down in southeast Wisconsin with Racine, and then another project in Kenosha. And some of the Wisconsin work was our early becomings of a national firm. We've really worked in every corner of the country since then, and including a lot of communities in Wisconsin, Greater Green Bay, the Oneida Nation, I-41 corridor, Milwaukee Technology Council, and obviously the reason that we're here today with the Greater Wausau region. And our team includes John and I obviously are part of the group that led the project for the Wausau Region Chamber, but a number of folks behind the scenes as well. And we've added a number of team members since we last worked with you a little over a year ago. One of the other things that we wanted to point out is just in this time of economic downturn and putting plans together for a recovery, we wanted to rely on some of the experience that we've had working with communities to recover from previous economic shocks. And that includes everything from natural disasters such as Katrina in the New Orleans area, Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast, man-made disasters. The BP oil spill affected communities down in the Gulf Coast, but also industry disruptions, major defense spending cuts, and other industry disruptions such as automotive sector in Detroit. And all of these experiences really can help us understand the types of strategies and approaches to help communities build a more resilient economy and help you recover, not just to where you were, but to a more equitable, more inclusive, more sustainable economy in the future. So that's kind of just an introduction or a reintroduction to many of you who were involved in the plan a couple of years ago. But we wanted to look at some of the larger trends that are affecting economic development. So I'll jump back in here in a minute, but John, why don't you go ahead? Good.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being part of this. And thank you, too, for the Secretary for his view. So some of the slides that we're going to show, a couple anyway, you will have seen before, but they've taken on a different sense of urgency since the onset of COVID-19. And I really want to emphasize that this slide that shows the percent of the workforce that's involved in manufacturing declining from 25% of the total workforce in 1970 to less than 10% a couple of years ago is really a slide that shows productivity gains as much as it shows anything about the participation in different sectors. And that sense of how an industry becomes more productive is going to be one of the big themes of this entire post-COVID-19 world. It's a different spin on it, because in the past, when we've talked about the decline in employment in manufacturing, it's had a largely negative connotation because manufacturing was the source of so many higher wage jobs. But if you see it in terms of productivity, you see something about the health of that sector. And I think as we move forward and look at some of the changes that are due to this economic restructuring, you'll see this in a different light as well. But here's the part that I think where an acceleration of trends becomes a matter of considerable concern. And we try to keep in mind that when we're looking at these national trends, how is it going to play out in Marathon County and Wausau? That's really foremost on our minds as we do these presentations. So what this chart shows was the recovery from the Great Recession that began, as you know, in 2007, 2008. Show that recovery by educational attainment level of the different jobs that were fueling the recovery. And so the shocking aspect of this particular graph is that almost all of the jobs that were gained after we came out of the Great Recession were given to those who had a college degree or higher. That's really quite extraordinary. And as we've discovered in talking to the folks in Wausau and elsewhere, this is not sustainable. There's no way that this is sustainable. However, as a trend, it's critically important that we understand it and that it's likely to follow the same pattern as we come out of the current recession. And I will be welcoming questions around this particular point as we move forward, and from the Secretary as well, because this one slide is as revealing of the kinds of economies that we'll have to build post-COVID-19 as anything else that we're going to look at. So in light of those trends, along comes the pandemic. And if you're like me, I'm a little tired of looking at this virus. It's depressing to look at, but let's look at what it means for economic development. And there's a lot to discuss here. And so I'm going to invite you to ask additional questions after our presentation, because obviously we could stop on any one of these slides and spend the remaining, all of our remaining time on that one or 2 points. The critical element that we want to communicate here is that all of the effects of the shutdown have a cascading impact. So no one thing by itself will give you a complete picture. These simultaneous shocks to supply and demand that we are seeing now, and oil and gas was just one example of that, continue to ripple through the economy. But the one I want to stop on for just a moment is the bottom one, and that is the importance of social justice in recovery and growth. I think we can realistically talk about 3 simultaneous crises that we're all facing. One obviously is the virus itself, the number of people that are affected by it and its impact on our health system. The second is the recession that follows that pandemic. And the third one is a crisis in leadership. And the crisis in leadership is really one that I would say has an economic development impact that we're still trying to deal with. And when I say crisis in leadership, I mean at every level of government, and not just of government. We can even talk about a crisis of leadership within the social protest movement. The inability, and in some cases unwillingness, to contain the violence. And if you're thinking I'm thinking that I'm going to mention Kenosha, absolutely I am. John mentioned earlier that we worked in Kenosha. Some of those restaurants and businesses that were looted and set on fire are ones that I frequented during the time that we worked in Kenosha. And I think that there's a crisis of leadership within the social justice movement to not be able to contain that. I happen to be in Oregon right now. The situation in Portland follows that same pattern. So the crisis of leadership is something that we all, I think, have to be attentive to, including people in economic development. But what's critical here is this acceleration of existing trends. I think it's important for us to step back and say, what has been the situation, instead of just trying to predict what strange new things are going to happen, is to understand that a lot of what we're experiencing now is something that has been ongoing, but that is now going to accelerate and is accelerating. And so in that sense, social equity is one of those. But within our economic development world, all of these different trends that we are seeing as top of the news are ones that we have, in a sense, been experiencing, but at a low rate. I think, John, you talked about a compression of events. How? Why don't you explain that just a little bit? Because I was really taken by that idea.
Yeah, when we think about the economic forces that were underway, and we'll talk about some of these in more detail, such as more people working remotely, for example, or online sales and e-commerce. These were trends that had been building over the last decade or 2 decades, and were going to take another decade to play out. But what has happened is that rather than taking 10 years to double the amount of online retail sales or the amount of remote workers, it's happened in a matter of months. So we're really compressing that time of a trend that was already going to happen, was almost inevitable, but it was inevitable over a longer period, and now it's really happening much, much shorter.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's really an important way to understand it. And again, we're trying to keep in mind here what this all means for Wausau. So one of the trends that has been ongoing, but that is rapidly accelerating, compressed, to use John's term, is supply chain restructuring. Now, what caused that in the first place was trade policy. And that trade policy had to do with tariffs and protection of national industries. Now, as you know, we're about to face a national election. What's intriguing to us, and we can say this in a very non-political way, is that the position of the Democrat Party at this point looks to be following the same pattern that we're seeing in the current administration when it comes to essentially an America First attitude toward imports and protecting American goods. That has been the message out of the Democrat side, and I think it's likely that that will continue. So even in advance of the multiple crises of the pandemic and of the economic restructuring that's taking place, is a continuation of a trade policy that will bring U.S. manufacturers back on shore. Now, in light of that earlier slide that we showed, it is important, and I think we can see that with GreenHack, and we can see it with companies throughout Wisconsin and the U.S., that reshoring doesn't necessarily come with significant employment gains, but it does come with huge economic benefits to the community. And I point out that distinction between the employment gains and the benefit to the community, because it would, at a minimum, and I hope the Secretary is still listening as we're talking here, that would change metrics and a change in training and a change in the talent equation. I think those are all going to be critical elements of thinking about the supply chain restructuring. And then of course, the remote work model. And we're all proof of that. We're on this, we've got, I think, 70 odd people the last I looked. And as we like to say at TIP, this has been a giant beta test to see whether we can in fact operate remotely, and we passed that test. And if you look at the percent of office employees, and this is from a couple months ago, I think, John, that this survey was done. Price Waterhouse did this survey, and when you look, and I would guess that already this has dramatically accelerated the percent of employees that feel that they will work remotely at least 1 day per week. I think we could put 2 days per week here and not change the rest of the graphics.
Yeah, and this is, so just earlier this week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that highlighted one of your state's largest private employers, Epic, down in Madison, and they're nearly 10,000 workers that the plans were everybody's coming back to the office, to the corporate campus in September, and they've pushed that back at least until next year, until 2020 will there be a requirement for folks to come back to the office. And we're seeing the same thing with large employers in Silicon Valley that are saying not until July of 2021 will people be required to come back to work. So it's actually leading to longer term decisions and maybe opportunities for smaller, less expensive, less dense regions like the Wausau area for people to relocate to.
And when we talked earlier about cascading effects, the ripple effects of any one of these things, most of you have thought about this already, but it's at the point now where we can start quantifying it. So one of the ripple effects of remote work is obviously on the real estate market, commercial real estate. We're going to be thinking very differently about that permanently. I would say permanently thinking differently about it. Another critical ripple effect here has to do with transportation. If in dense communities, if you're commuting even 1 day less, certainly at 2 days you begin to change the entire equation and of mobility. And there isn't a single city in the country, we know from having looked at the data, whose public transit isn't being affected by this in significant ways. So when people can work from home, it doesn't mean that they're going to work there permanently from home. Obviously, that can't, as we'll see in a moment here, can't be done. However, when you have even a 20%, and this is the 1 day a week, change in work patterns, it has tremendous ramifications in all kinds of other areas. And to my point, not everyone can work from home. And this is part of the inequity issue, again, because if you look at the racial demographics, and we're going to look at it in another slide here in a moment, around the ability to work from home, that pattern really favors certain ethnic groups. And so the luxury, if you will, to work from home is both by the kind of occupation that you're in, and we can talk broadly about tech versus touch. Those who have tech-related skills are typically, not typically, I think almost universally higher wage earners, as opposed to those who are touch-oriented, meaning that they have to interact with a customer in some way. So this becomes critical in that respect. And now looking at the disparity crisis by ethnicity, this really shows race and ethnicity by remote job occupations in the US. And this is all jobs versus remote jobs. And among the Anglo population, it's split roughly evenly. But as we look at Hispanic and Black, we see that it's almost half in the case of Hispanic population of the ability to work remotely versus all their jobs. And the only one that shows a positive gain is the Asian American population. So those disparity issues, I think, are going to become critical. And then we're going to look at one or two more sectors, and I want to move ahead a little bit because this is fun to talk about, but of course there are so many different issues to look at. But look at retail sales. Now, I think all of you know that as individual users that you're using online marketplaces more than you have in the past. What's intriguing to me about this slide is that from 2000 to 2020, first quarter of 2020, that has been a steady progression of an increase of online sales. But at the end of 2020, the first quarter, end of 2019, we were still buying only 12% of all of our goods online. Now, that actually shocked me. Now, if this shows itself doubling in the next 5 years, in other words, going to a not just this kind of linear progression in sales, but actually a quantum leap, that will not surprise anyone. We're going to be getting more data on this soon. Now, again, the ripple effects and what this means for communities, what this means for Wausau, that's what's on our minds here. And one of the things that it means is that retail sales dependency for those communities that are retail sales dependent is going to be devastating. It's that way in Oklahoma and Texas, and it's going to be that way. It's not that way here in Oregon, where I am at the moment, and it's not that way in Montana. So it'll vary unevenly across the different jurisdictions, but it will affect all communities, both in terms of municipal budgets and in terms of employment. And then healthcare. So I don't know how many of you have availed yourself of telemedicine in the sense of having virtual visits to the doctors. I certainly have. John, I know you have. But again, the rise of this is not equitable. In other words, for you to avail yourself of it, telehealth, it means that you have to have a good internet connection. You have to have levels of privacy that we can't assume everyone has. So it's the uneven benefits in some cases. But let me stress here that it was benefits. So trends that were already in place accelerate. And with it, there's a cascading effect across all of our economic development goals. And then as I near the end here, let me just say that there are new job vulnerabilities. And this looks at the unemployment rate, and I'd love the Secretary to weigh in on this as well. This is unemployment rate by occupational group. And I would be curious, I've looked at the state of Washington because the Puget Sound area put out data. John, you saw those data points of unemployment claims by occupation. But this is the national picture. And I would be surprised if Wisconsin is very different, but it might be. So basically, the unemployment filings are a way to understand this better. But what you see here is that that same distinction between the ability to work from home means that you are less likely to become unemployed. And of course, less likely to file for unemployment insurance. And then if you overlay that by race and ethnicity, you see the inequitable pattern that begins to emerge as a result of it. So 11.2% for all occupations. This was back in June. That's changed a little bit now. Obviously, it's dropped to some degree. But the pattern here on professional and related occupations, management and business, and I think the only exception on the high touch is farming and fishing. That's the only exception there. So I'm going to end with a look at the fact that while certain trends accelerate, others slow. And the slowing of those trends and understanding how that will play out over time is critically important. And I think this is really where we have Wausau on our mind with each of these. And I'm going to spend maybe a minute or two and then turn it back over to John to talk about the repositioning from COVID-19. So first of all, the slowing trends is global trade. Now, everything indicates that that will continue to be true. That means that if your businesses are heavily dependent on export, or import for that matter, it's time to have a really different kinds of discussion with your industry clusters about what that looks like. And we've had some of those discussions with others in Wisconsin already, including in the dairy industry. As part of that is the decline in foreign direct investment, FDI, as it's called in economic development, down 40% in 2020. So that slowing of FDI is likely to continue, but not evenly. I think that's the other thing to emphasize on these trends. You're seeing Japanese car manufacturers entering into deals right now. You're seeing it in Toyota, Mazda, and new factories. So that particular trend is important for Wausau to keep note of. Now, tourism and hospitality. Tourism and hospitality is arguably the most complicated. It's clear that if you're in the cruise line industry, the hit you're taking may be damaging well beyond these next 2 years. However, being in Bend, Oregon, as I am right now, and having talked to people in various tourism-dependent communities, you're seeing a counter trend that looks to the last point on this slide, which is urban migration. I was talking briefly with Dave Ekman just before we got on live with everyone about the real estate market, the residential real estate market, and the pattern in the 5 or 6 communities that I have talked to recently. So still anecdotal, not supported by data yet, is a tremendous surge in home values in select regional communities, especially those that have transitioned to outdoor tourist-related activities. I see John shaking his head. We've had this discussion internally. Every community that we look at to verify that pattern has met that same. And so I think the implications for Wausau could be dramatic. And in light of the urban migration here, I think it's too early to say anything conclusive about that. I saw that Jerry Seinfeld had an editorial yesterday in the New York Times, which is basically, don't write New York City off. The movement out of the city may be temporary, and who am I to contradict Jerry Seinfeld? However, if you're looking just at the real estate market in regional centers, especially those that have good medical facilities, which obviously includes Marathon County and Wausau, and outdoor recreational activities, I think the opportunities are dramatic. And then the other trend that has been slowing is small business startups and expansions. I think if you burrow down into where those opportunities are and not just talk about broad-based entrepreneurship, and really look at it almost in a reverse model, which is to say using small business and startups to address specific community problems, then you'll see some kind of opportunities emerging. So from the slowing trends discussion to what that means for Wausau, I think is a conversation that we will want to have. And John, you can begin that when we talk about repositioning of the region from post-COVID-19. Thank you.
Yes. So in light of all these changes, some of which were already underway and have been increasing, others were experiencing a slowdown, we wanted to take a fresh look at what can Wausau do, the Marathon County and the Wausau region, to position itself in an even stronger way coming out of this and into a recovery. And we do have to acknowledge, of course, that despite having a pretty good handle on some of the trends that John just described, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And on the one hand, during times of extreme uncertainty, that leads to creativity and ingenuity. If you think about previous downturns, many of the most successful and most innovative companies that are leading industries today were started during downturns, especially when there's so many people unemployed. They have bootstrapped themselves and created new technologies, new products, new services. But it's also worth keeping in mind that when we think about all the different types of uncertainty, there's an argument to be made that some of those can counterbalance each other. It's certainly true in things such as weather and storm prediction. When there's conflicting models, they can sort of balance each other out. The same is true with political polling. But I think that some of the trends that we just talked about can counterbalance each other. So the urban migration and flight out of dense, expensive cities like New York and San Francisco, and probably Chicago to that matter as well. There's certainly initial data that's showing that, but when you have such an interest in leaving those centers, the prices, at least in the short term, can decrease. So then there's an investment flight that wants to look for a deal. So there's some counterbalancing of these uncertainties. So even though things can look as uncertain as ever, we shouldn't put our hands up and say we should just stop planning. I think now is the best time to take a fresh look at how can Wausau reposition itself and come out of this even stronger. So just the framework that we've been encouraging communities to use to assess the current situation and look at how the recovery can be accelerated and restart activities, and then ultimately with an eye toward positioning the region for being more competitive. Those are at a high level, those are the questions that we encourage you all to think through for the Wausau region. But more specifically, beyond just the framework, there's really the types of questions that you should be asking related to economic development and diversification and recovery, there's some tactical considerations on the chamber and the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership really needs to be thinking about is how do you modify the activities already underway? What needs to be added? How can you encourage, for example, remote work within your organizations and companies? And also, what's the role of local government, Marathon County, the city of Wausau, other communities in the county, to really drive some of the change that needs to happen and maybe become the customer for new types of services, and then building in a more inclusive and equitable growth into the programs and activities. So these are some of the more specific questions that we think you need to be thinking about as you enter a recovery and move to the next phase of implementation of the economic development plan for the region. And the types of strategies that are inevitably going to come into play, there's really three categories, and this can apply to an individual company, but we think it definitely applies to economic development and the activities of the region related to economic development. The role of innovation is certainly going to increase, and everything with how products and services get delivered to customers, the supply chain, but also how training and workforce training happens. The role of efficiency. How can governments and organizations operate in a more effective, efficient way? Obviously, with the state workforce department and the secretary's description of how they've had to operate much more efficiently, that's a great example of responding to the current situation. And then I don't think we can fool ourselves to think that there won't be significant consolidation. And this applies to everything from government and education, but also the private sector, mergers and acquisitions. From a private sector side, we're seeing this in different industries, and you saw that obviously and have experienced it in Wausau with the footlocker.com East Bay consolidation that is leading to a loss of jobs locally. So these are some of the strategies and types of strategies that are going to come into play. Before we talk about what's next and what's been accomplished, we did want to take a look at some of the past trends locally that were underway and just ask the question of, are they going to be accelerated or perhaps change directions?
And John, before you move on, if we go back a slide to the questions of efficiency, discussions that we had very early in the onset of the pandemic, as early as March, had major employers saying that wherever it was possible to reduce actual physical interaction within the company and with the customer, wherever it was possible to do that, the companies were going to do it. Now, let me give you just one example of the ripple effects that can have when you take that position. And the example I like to use is a trivial one that you all experience or had experienced almost every day, which is when you pay for your meal ticket at the end of a dinner or lunch. You ask for the check. The check is brought to you. You pull out a credit card. The person takes the bill and the credit card back, brings it all back to you, and it's a multi-step process. It's tremendously inefficient. We've always known it was inefficient, but it didn't really matter that much. So what's happened with COVID-19 is the fact that we want to limit that physical interaction. Now, whether we want to do that in the future isn't relevant. We've exposed the inefficiency of the system. Now, if you think about that across all of your industries and you say to yourself, where has the interaction between customer and seller or within the company, where has that physical interaction been unnecessary? And we haven't really seen it as being inefficient, and now we do. So this question of COVID-19 accelerating certain trends around efficiency, I think, is something that every single organization and company is going to be looking at. And John, we could talk about this quite a while, but we saw that with our friends in Las Vegas, where I had a long conversation with the city manager who said, the way that we were processing building permits, the way that we were handling payments from utility customers, all of that has been exposed as being really significantly inefficient. And it didn't seem to matter before, and now we realize that we can do things much more cheaper out of necessity. So that point is one that I hope we have some questions on, because it goes across both the public and the private sector.
Yeah, thank you, John, for diving in a little bit deeper on that one, because it's really important. So in order to make sure that we allow for enough time for Q&A, I think we'll probably go through some of these fairly quickly, but we did want to touch on a lot of the data that we analyzed when we put together the strategic plan just over a year ago, and ask ourselves, how relevant is this data, and maybe what's changed, and how do we need to respond? So just looking at the stagnant population growth, what we saw was pretty much slow growth, very slow growth in the county, somewhat at the expense of the city of Wausau, which was losing population. So this is one of those trends that we want to pay close attention to in the future. Another one, and we talked about this in the recovery from the last recession, essentially all of the economic gains went to segments of the workforce that had some level of higher education beyond a high school diploma. And just like the state of Wisconsin, Marathon County, you perform pretty well at the basic levels of educational attainment, in terms of a smaller percentage of your workforce that is lacking a high school diploma than the U.S. as a whole, but not as large of a college educated workforce with at least a bachelor's degree or higher. And if this economic recovery is anything like the last one, we know that the future growth is going to happen at the higher end of the educational spectrum. So that's a real significant area of focus to work on, is increasing levels of educational attainment up and down the spectrum. So this is an open question, how the migration patterns are going to be changed. In the past, Marathon County had gained residents, a significant amount of net population growth from surrounding more small and rural counties, but you had lost population to larger urban centers like Green Bay, Madison, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. The questions of how, especially those denser urban centers, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, are people going to be leaving those areas and looking for the type of lifestyle options that Wausau and Marathon County provide? It seems like there's some great opportunities there. So this is one of those areas that we want to pay really close attention to. So when we look at the major industries that really drive the economy, it's no surprise that manufacturing is the dominant industry in Marathon County, followed by healthcare and retail. And the future of employment in each of those, manufacturing, we've talked about as being increasingly driven by investments in technology. Healthcare is one of those sectors that has weathered past recessions well, and there's real significant investments in innovation moving forward that are promising with Aspirus and with Marshfield. But retail, the fact that was your third largest employer, that's going to change dramatically, and e-commerce is going to lift the fortunes of transportation and warehousing at the expense of retail trade, just as one example of where employment will actually happen. So when we looked at the employment change over the last decade, the growth of corporate and regional headquarters, which is not really an industry, but is companies that are based in the Wausau area, and that includes everything from healthcare to manufacturing, was one of the biggest employment gains. Healthcare was another one, and you were already losing a significant number of retail jobs, and that shift to more productivity and less employment in manufacturing was already well underway. So this is something that we're also looking at. And when we did the SWOT analysis last time, we tried to take a local as well as a larger national and global perspective to look at your strengths, things such as the different lifestyle options from urban to suburban to rural, but also the outdoor recreation as a real unique strength. The weaknesses as well. So when we looked at the amenities not matching up to some other communities in Wisconsin and larger areas, especially such as Appleton and Green Bay, and then the challenges of not having widespread broadband throughout the county was something that we looked at, and that's been we were right to call that out as a challenge and included that in the plan. And some of the threats were the flip side of those threats are opportunities to do things differently, such as the decline of the Wausau Center Mall and then mall redevelopment, the threats facing your industries, such as manufacturing and agriculture, and then some of the workforce challenges that not only the Wausau region faces, but every community around the country looking to have a skilled workforce and be more competitive. So just two more quick slides before we transition to talking about the plan and what's been accomplished so far. We did a survey that had 328 responses. And one of the questions we asked was, how competitive is the Wausau region for attracting workers, attracting jobs, and attracting investment? And the answers to those questions depended almost entirely on how old or what generation people are in. If we asked the older generations, the baby boomers, most people felt like the region is pretty competitive. But when we asked the youngest segment of the workforce, millennials, the vast majority said, no, this region is not competitive. So this is something that if you're looking to attract outside talent, you really want to be understanding what your local workforce thinks of the region. Because if they don't view the Wausau region as a good place to stay long-term, then they're going to look for opportunities elsewhere. So that really drove a lot of our thinking in the plan. And just to summarize some of the major assets and opportunities, obviously the big industries and existing employers were some of the most significant assets, as well as the unique amenities, the downtown area, the outdoor recreation and sports culture, major development sites, as well as the role of the region as really a hub for so much of central and northern Wisconsin. The big challenges, the threats facing your major industries, we talked about the educational attainment and the outmigration of talent, especially the younger generations were some of the biggest threats. So the Economic Development Strategic Plan was organized into three goals, basically talent, innovation, and placemaking. And each one of these has a task force that is charged with leading implementation efforts. So just as a summary of what was recommended in each one of those, recruiting and retaining talent, the need to create a new brand that positions the region as a place that is appealing, especially for outdoor recreation, but beyond just outdoor recreation, telling the stories of the unique assets and employment opportunities and the unique culture in the region. So launching a new talent attraction effort and really embracing the diversity in the population, the local Hmong community as one example of that, and really aligning the employers and educational partners from NTC down to the K through 12 and addressing the talent needs by developing the workforce locally, but also attracting new talent from outside and increasing the higher education base. So one of the biggest challenges is not having a 4-year comprehensive universities, so strategies to address that.
And let me point out, John, and you were probably going to say this, but that each of these major themes interact with each other. It's not as if they stand alone. The communities that have been most successful are the ones that have linked. I mentioned earlier that that the folks in Bend took their outdoor recreation theme and used it to recruit and retain talent. So there was a place advantage that linked to talent, and then fairly easily moved over to innovation. I say fairly easily, and that may be a little bit misleading because it was a concerted effort on the part of the economic development folks to say the industries we want to target are innovative industries. It doesn't happen by accident. And I'll give just one quick example, if I may, John. This is my wife pointed this out to me, who had been coming to Bend since she was had begun skiing very early on, and there was a butte, Bachelor Butte, that was the ski destination, but calling it a butte just didn't attract anyone from outside the state. It was rechristened as Mount Bachelor and is now a major ski destination. So sometimes as small a marketing change can have a huge impact, and Mount Bachelor is now known across the entire West Coast as a desirable ski location. Bachelor Butte, not so much. And so what's in a name change can have a huge marketing impact. And again, ripples across all three of these. So forgive us. I know we want to speed ahead. So John, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that thanks for pointing that out, John, that each one of the major goals supports each other. And the focus on innovation is something that really didn't come out of nowhere. It came from your existing industries. The Green Heck Innovation Center, the opportunities to better link your existing companies to the technology and innovation efforts happening in Madison and with UW-Madison in particular, but also over in Green Bay with Titletown Tech and what the Packers are doing there. There's a lot of opportunities for increasing the amount of innovation in your existing companies, but also recruitment of smaller and mid-sized companies to support your existing industries in manufacturing and healthcare, food processing and agriculture in particular. And then supporting all of it is really this emphasis on quality of place and the opportunities, not just in the downtown and with the redevelopment of the Wausau Center Mall, although that's really where a lot of this needs to focus, but up and down the Wisconsin River. And we talked about broadband, and we were right to focus on broadband access throughout the county as really a driving factor for future economic development. So that's a quick summary of the three goals and what we recommended. But we did want to just highlight some of the major successes in just a little over a year that the plan was adopted and unveiled. One of the big questions with any strategic plan is, how are you going to implement this? Under what organizational structure? And we're really excited about the organizational structure that has been put in place with the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership to really serve as the lead implementer and facilitator of turning this plan into reality. So the two sides of that are the corporate leadership team representing the private sector and the major industries, but also the advisory body representing different interests throughout the county and local governments and education. And this group is really, it's fantastic that it came together so quickly and that it has been responsible for some of the other accomplishments that we just wanted to quickly highlight. So the talent attraction website, and really it's more than just a website, but it's the home base for your new brand and talent recruitment efforts is just fantastic. And it really tells the stories of the amenities and outdoor opportunities and the personal stories and families that have relocated to the area and have made a home in the Wausau area. This is a real success that I think you're going to see many, many more positive results from in the next few years. And then, of course, not just telling the stories, but actually investing in the unique assets that you have and further developing them. So this is with the Rib Mountain State Park Master Plan and the future of the Granite Peak ski area, but also the other biking and hiking and other opportunities there. This is another one of those great opportunities that we're excited about. And then the future of the downtown and to some extent the region depends on what happens with the redevelopment of the Wausau Center Mall. So how quickly you've been able to put together the development team, the master planning team, and start to re-envision what that site can become, you're in many ways ahead of a lot of the competition. There's over 1,000 similar malls around the country, many of which have already gone under and are looking for a new life, and hundreds more over the next few months and years that are going to require some sort of redevelopment. So you're well on that path, and we're really excited about that. Not just the mall, but some of the historic, unique assets that you have in the downtown area. So the Clark Island Powerhouse building is another one of those that can really add to the quality of place in the downtown and along the riverfront as a unique destination for talent and industry. And then the last one I think here, this is the last that we have, and we'll get into our Q&A, is really addressing the challenge of not having a major higher education presence. And you're well on your way toward having a what we call a center of excellence, which is thinking about the unique talent needs and innovation needs in your industries and bringing different entities and institutions together to address those. So with the very strong presence of manufacturing locally, the need to move toward a more innovative model of production and the types of engineering programs that are required to really create that innovation, and bringing together different institutions locally, but also from outside, such as UW Stout, to address that. That's something that we're excited about. So that is the end of our formal presentation, and we look forward to responding to any questions.
All right. Exciting stuff. Okay, thanks again to both John and John. There's a lot of exciting things taking place, and we did receive a few questions. So if anyone from the audience has additional questions, feel free. We invite you to submit your questions in the chat feature at this time, and we'll go ahead and take some of the questions that have come in over the dialogue. The first question is from Laura. And it's in reference to commercial real estate. So as far as like administrative type buildings, do you anticipate or do you have feelings about how to repurpose those buildings or market them to new types of industry that's emerging and that would still be in need of brick and mortar type locations?
So I'll jump in, and then John, you go as well. So the answer is we don't. The broader question is it would be unrealistic to give you a sense of confidence here about the way that these buildings are going to be used. However, the trend clearly is to apply the same standard that we're seeing in the malls and some of the commercial buildings in major metro areas, which is reconfigure them and then market them based on the reconfigured design. The companies that we've talked to that are doing this are seeing tremendous interest in that, but it's too early to say whether the marketing of these is going to be successful. Clearly, there's a redesign component to that. There's a cost element to the redesign component, and in some cases, I think that you're just going to have to be able to sit on your hands for a certain period of time because no one is making any rapid commercial real estate decisions that aren't purpose-driven. John, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Well, I'll just go back to the question of the different types of uncertainty counterbalancing each other. This is one where we don't know exactly how the commercial real estate changes are going to play out. And we think back to one of the things we recommended in the plan was to create co-working space for commercial office. And that's something that has taken a real hit in the short term, but long term, as many more companies think about whether they want to sign a long-term lease and what do they actually need their office space for meetings and gatherings, but maybe not for assuming that everybody's going to commute 5 days a week to the office. That may come back and be a great option long term. So there's a lot of questions out there.
Well, and if my answer sounds a little vague, let me ground it in a post-COVID story, which is the use of the Las Vegas City Hall to house, a major call center, if you will, and under Tony Hsieh's operation there. So I think that you because of the central location of public buildings, the ability to reconfigure them for private sector purposes is definitely, there are definitely examples of that have been successful. And so that's a potential advantage that you would have in Wausau as well.
Okay. The next question we have is from Ben. And he asks, when talking about job growth and losses, is there a way to quantify? So how do you account for the rise in remote working workers to the Wausau area? So if somebody is counted as local employment, are they counted at all or somewhere in between?
Well, they are counted as local employment. And there's a difference in, as we've discussed before, and it's not easy to grasp. It takes me a while to grasp, but still, there's a difference between industry employment, which is not place specific, and then there's local employment numbers. Am I saying that right, John?
Yes.
So if for instance a major manufacturer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, not chosen entirely at random, hired a series of people to do a call center out of Wausau, the industry numbers would show up for that industry, but you would show the local employment gains.
Okay, I have a couple questions here that I'm actually going to ask that Dave Ekman address. One of the questions is in reference to East Bay's Foot Locker. So Dave, can you share what your knowledge is of whether or not the city of Wausau was in any type of negotiation with East Bay Foot Locker to keep their headquarters in the Wausau area?
Renee, I don't know specifically the details that were being discussed between the city. I do know the city was engaged in a dialogue with East Bay Foot Locker, but be mindful that when we have purchases that happen outside our community of corporate entities, that the likelihood of risk of losing that company dramatically increases right away. And in this environment, even ahead of the pandemic, they made a very strong strategic decision that was based on their global position as a corporation. Could you maybe have kept a company here like that? Pretty hard on things that we're up against, education attainment, and the ability of bringing diverse workforce to a community, which is part of their corporate culture. Things that you can't necessarily buy or invest in from a local effort, but we're trying to build as a community. Why diversity is so important to the future of this community.
Okay. I also have an additional question, Dave, that hopefully you can address as well. And it's in regards to the redevelopment or the long-term redevelopment of the mall. And maybe you can share some insight of not only the redevelopment of the mall, but the downtown revitalization.
Yeah, if we were talking about Ben's question, will the city be soliciting developer proposals? The city's a partner in the Wausau Opportunity Zone Incorporated. So between the two foundations, the Judd S. Alexander, the Dwight and Linda Davis Foundation, and the City of Wausau, Primary Ownership Group was incorporated, now owns the mall. And so as we start to develop the future development of the mall, WAS Inc. will entertain proposals. WAS Inc. will not be the primary developer. It's the owner of the mall, and it's going to establish the partnerships necessary to bring investment to Wausau. There could be local developers that are going to be interested in doing specific things, but I can tell you, because it's in an opportunity zone, the world really is an opportunity for us to market investment dollars so that companies or wealth holders can invest into the opportunity zone and take advantage of those federal credits that are part of that. So there will be open, ample opportunities for development proposals, Renee.
Okay, thank you. At this time, it looks like that's all we have for questions. But before we conclude, I just wanted to open it up for any last thoughts or anything you'd like to add today for either Secretary Frostman, our friends from TIP, or even Dave. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up with some closing comments?
Renee, I have one thought for John and John, or just an observation, and it ties to Laura's initial question. Last week when I was traveling, I learned REI, of which just built a brand new 8-acre campus in Bellevue, is not even going to enter the building. They're putting it up for sale. Brand new campus. And then Amazon now is looking at boxes like Sears and JCPenney to put smaller distribution centers. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'd be interested actually to hear John's take on this as well. I think this is not an answer, John, and Dave's certainly not an answer, except to say that this reconfiguration of commercial real estate is a counter trend to what we're seeing in residential real estate, with this huge boom that's occurring on single family residential, especially in communities that provide a broad range of amenities, including medical. Let me just be pessimistic here for a moment, and that's not in my nature. But I do see a fundamental shift in commercial real estate, and this is to the earlier question about the use of public buildings for other purposes. I think that this answer is going to emerge over the next year or so, probably not less than that, in which the percent of use, in other words, the work from home option, I don't think will change dramatically. And I don't think I'm betraying any confidences here to say that in our discussions with Shriver in Green Bay, that the whole notion of that corporate headquarters was already changing. That they're not going to walk away from it, but the idea of hoteling is the term that they used very early on. And so the notion that people will have to be physically present. This is my point about us really doing a giant beta test of our ability to work from home and passing that test. And so you really have to ask yourself on the commercial real estate side, what purpose does the building serve? And I want to approach this with great caution, because depending on how this is answered, it has huge ripple effects across all industries, especially in professional services. So, John, tell me that I'm being unduly pessimistic here.
I don't know. I mean, when we think back to the mid 2000s, and I guess 2007 maybe was peak big box retail space, are we going to look back at 2020 as peak commercial office space? Maybe. And Dave, I saw the same article about REI and their super hip brand new headquarters, and I don't know what they're selling it for, but probably half of what they built, they spent to build it. And there's the purpose of really hip, really high design, high value office space until earlier this year was a lot of it was around talent attraction and retention. And here in downtown Austin, there's a 700,000 square foot tower being built. It's well underway right now, and Google has leased the entire thing. At least they did about a year ago. And now Google has said that nobody's going to work in any office for at least the next year. So what's the future of all of those types of office spaces if the main purpose was to attract and retain talent and obviously to provide an efficient collaborative work environment? If we've proven with some notable challenges that we can work remotely, at least the office workers and the technical and professional workers, just as efficiently as for the most part we could in a commercial office, there are going to be a lot of changes in that office space. Conversion to residential is one major option, but yeah.
Right. And again, knowing what's high tech and what's high touch. So, knowing also that in medical, which we have thought of as high touch before, we're proving that we can do that in a high tech way. And that the actual why am I going into the doctor question, we didn't individually ask ourselves that. We just took it for granted. That's what we did. But now, for a great many of the consultations that we have that we would have had to go to physically, we're saying, oh, guess what? I can do this reasonably. So the short answer to your question is, Dave, we don't know, but I'm very pessimistic about it continuing in the same pattern that it had prior to COVID-19.
On the positive side, though, this is a great time to be re-envisioning and rethinking the future of your existing spaces and the Wausau Center Mall in particular. Mm-hmm. Rather than going all in on something that you would have done a year ago, now you can think, what are things going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years, and how do we want to reposition that site in light of that?
Well, and the same with the Powerhouse as well. I mean, the Powerhouse has outdoor space, and one of the things that so captivated us when Dave and John and I first walked along the river and saw the Powerhouse was its access to the river. And so, I think that kind of bespoke building, if you will, for entrepreneurial space with some potential for using the outdoors and reconfiguring it in that way, that has real appeal. And I think we'll continue to have, people will still want to gather. It's not like we're not going to want to come together again, but we're going to do it in a different way. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be part of this again. And we look forward to, and I said we have a question about making the presentation available. Absolutely, we will. And you can reach out to us individually or through Dave and Renee. So thank you all for having us. Dave?
Okay, Renee, take it away.
Thanks, guys. So as John shared, this webcast is actually being recorded. So we'll have the link available. It'll be shared to the Chamber's website and our social media channels, including YouTube. And then also we are able to share both presentations from Secretary Frostman as well as tip strategies. So we'll be distributing that as well. And before we conclude today, I really just want to thank everyone. Sincere thank you to Secretary Frostman, John Roberts, John Karras, as well as everyone who joined us for today's live webcast. I also really want to recognize that this has been a community effort. We want to thank the many businesses, the organizations, our education partners, both post-secondary and our K-12 education partners, community leaders, for not only your support, but for really contributing your time and your resources to charting a new path for the greater Wausau region. And we want to thank our Business Week sponsors, everyone who made this week possible. You can find more details on all of this week's events for Business Week at the wausauchamber.com. And in addition, keep an eye out. We're going to have some upcoming programming in the coming months, including a series of podcasts highlighting the various economic development initiatives that were shared during today's webcast presentation. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.